Roma and Julia had been together for nearly 10 years. Roma's relationship with his wife was enviable. Mutual respect, love, care. These and many other kind words could be said about the two of them. But it was not always like this. Hysterical Julia drank a lot of blood from her future spouse when they began dating. The calm romance steadfastly endured all the scandals, not reacting in any way to them. And soon the girl stopped behaving in the usual way. When Roma decided to propose, he reasoned sensibly that he would have to spend a lot of money, and his current job left much to be desired. It was enough to live on, of course, but no more. So he approached his father, who offered him a position with them. The position demanded intelligence and diligence, but it also paid well. The only downside was frequent business trips. On reflection, Roma agreed and stayed there for good. He found the work to his liking. During departures of the spouse, Julia always had the support in the form of her older sister and her husband. Both Ina's and Julia's parents had died before the younger one finished school, and in their absence, the older sister took on the role of a concerned mother. Every now and then she called Julia to find out how she was doing, what she was eating, and how her personal life was going. The difference in their ages was as much as 12 years, and the younger one was terribly angry that the older one still considered her not very bright. At first, she often shouted into Ina's phone, "You're not my mother." Then she dropped the call and sniffed tensely for a long time, thinking how to jab her sister more painfully to make her more offended. Ina to attacks from Julia, accustomed as a child, and in general had a temper and could not sulk long at her sister. It was only later the younger sister realized how she really annoyed and hurt the one who tried to replace her mother. 3 years ago, Ina married a man named Peter. Julia rejoiced that her beloved sister had finally found personal happiness. After her first failed marriage, Roma and Pedia became friends immediately. Men found a lot of common interests, and one of them was Julia. Peter had his eye on his wife's sister when they met, but all the time he pulls himself back, reminding himself that he is married to another woman. So he secretly sighs over Julia a whole year, until one of the family holidays, which are traditionally celebrated at the cottage, a woman suddenly broke into his room with the obvious purpose. After that night, their tete-a-tete meetings became permanent. The naive affair knew nothing of his wife's adventures or of his companion's help in his absence. He could not have guessed that a future family drama was playing out behind his back. Perhaps the lovers would have been playing around for a long time if chance had not shown their hand. Never before in all the time that Julia and Pedia had been together had they allowed themselves to go away for long periods of time. It was a short meeting at her home in the absence of her husband, or in the car somewhere near the city. For the first time, the cheaters ventured into the new and unexplored, to go away for a few days together to a recreation center. It was something exciting for them. Peter told his wife that he had been asked to come to the head office of the company where he worked. And Julia texted Roman that she and her friends were going on vacation to picturesque places away from the city. Roma, of course, believed him. After all, he did not have the slightest reason to suspect Julia of something forbidden. On Saturday, Roma was awakened by a phone call. The first time, he successfully ignored it, deciding that he would still finish his quota. But the caller was persistent and called back several more times. The irritated, sleep-deprived man rudely answered, "Roma." He heard in the receiver the concerned voice of the neighbor who lived in the apartment below. The tone of his voice changed abruptly. "I'm listening, Lyubov Valentinovna. Is something wrong?" The woman said that there was water pouring from the ceiling, and she had already found out that the floor upstairs was dry. So the problem was in her and Yulia's apartment. Roma tensed up. He knew that his wife was out of town and would not be for another 24 hours. He needed to call Pedia and Ina to solve the problem as soon as possible before his wife flitted someone else. Roman thanked his neighbor for the call, hastily found the number of his friend in the phone, called, but the answer was silence. The subscriber was unavailable. The man cursed and called his wife. Everything was repeated. With anger and confusion, he squeezed the phone so that his hands trembled. Inna answered almost immediately. She listened to her son-in-law's loud story. "And where is Julia?" asked the woman a logical question. "Left for the hell knows where," shouted Roma in her ear. "And I did not say anything." "Pedya also left. I'm alone at home," confused Inna muttered. And that he too turned off the phone. Unlike Roman, who had no idea his wife was cheating, Inna knew everything about her husband. He was definitely seeing someone. She just hadn't figured out who yet. Now, when she heard from her son-in-law that her sister's and her husband's phones had been turned off and they were both out of town, it pained her to speculate that it might not be a simple coincidence. But she didn't tell Roman about her suspicions, so as not to disturb him in vain. She promised the agitated man that she would go to their house right away, shut off the water, and solve all the problems. He thanked her warmly and passed out. With heavy thoughts, Inna drove to her sister's house. Once she entered her in-laws' apartment and went into the kitchen to shut off the water. On the kitchen table, the woman found something that definitely should not have been lying there: her husband's wristwatch. She knew for a fact that Roman did not wear one, preferring a more sporty version. And it was hard to mix up something that she herself had given as a gift several years ago with all her heart. On the back of the dial, there were 2 engraved letters, PK. These were the initials of her husband. Inna's heart clenched in pain. She was afraid to tell everything to her son-in-law. He could not believe, scold her, and after all, maybe she made it all up. Maybe the watch was here by accident. When Pedya dropped off her sister's groceries so she wouldn't have to lug heavy bags from the store. But her gut told her it wasn't. Roman listened to the confused story of Inna, did not interrupt. He could hardly believe what he had heard, but she had a weighty argument in every sense: the watch. He asked her to postpone her decision, not to cut off her shoulders and wait until he himself would come to town and the 2 of them would put pressure on the traitors. With a heavy heart, Inna agreed. The woman purposely prepared dinner for the day she and Roma agreed to relieve the lovers. All week, she had not been at ease, wondering how it would be. But it didn't turn out the way she had envisioned. Neither of them denied what they had done. When Roman asked them the main question of the evening, both Pedya and Julia answered in the affirmative almost immediately. None of them even hesitated. After the confession, there was no point in continuing the dinner. The lovers apologized to their soulmates, packed up, and left. Roma and Inna were left sitting opposite each other with their mouths open with surprise and their hearts broken by betrayal. After the divorce, Roma didn't even want to hear about his ex-wife, but sometimes some information reached him. He knew that Pedya and Julia had gotten together and even had a child together. But after 3 years of marriage, she caught him in bed with an unknown woman. In a way, Roma was glad that his ex-wife had experienced on her own skin what she herself had done. The man gloated. The boomerang, sent by Julia herself, came back and with a clear, hard blow, shattered her whole life. The next story is no less interesting either. In it, just one call hid the truth about his wife's cheating and carried with it a huge and ingenious revenge. Robert and Lisa had been married for 6 years. They say opposites attract, and this couple was a perfect illustration of that statement. Lisa had always been very temperamental and cheerful, and Robert had always been very quiet, sometimes even a little amorphous and somewhat passive. But these qualities of the husband did not prevent his wife from being jealous of him of everything in the world. For Robert, it was strange because, in his opinion, he did not give the slightest reason to doubt his faithfulness. He always came home on time, and if he was late, he usually gave a warning. He didn't like any kind of reticence and always said everything straightforwardly, expecting the same from others. But Lisa didn't speak about the reasons of her wild jealousy directly. Probably it was just her character, her possessive nature. Her husband has long talked with his wife about having a child, but she constantly put these conversations off or just walked away from them with all her might. On the one hand, her husband understood that Lisa was too freedom-loving and did not want to be stuck at home with a baby for the whole maternity leave. But on the other hand, they had been together for so many years. It was time to think in the direction of expanding the family. All conditions for that have been created. While the man was thinking about the continuation of the family and how their life will change, Lisa was thinking about something else. But she did not acquaint her husband with this. The woman began to stay at work more and more often. Lisa sometimes did not even tell him that she would be home late. She would just come in and tell him where she was. At first, Robert didn't ask his wife anything and the sudden increase in workload, and then he just put up with it. He trusted her as himself. So over time, it was hard for him to accept the fact that the constant tardiness of his wife might not be because of work. One day after dinner together, Lisa, as if suddenly remembered, announced her imminent trip to her parents for a few days. They needed help with a couple of things, and they had not seen each other for a long time. So let me come with you. It's been a long time since we went out. Robert suggested we combine business with pleasure, and put his arm around his wife. She looked at him a little aloof, and her touch made her shiver a little. "No need. I'd want to go alone," she answered, trying to remain calm. Her husband was upset by this reaction. He tried to insist on his trip, said he could take the weekend, but his wife had already made up her mind. He had to let her go, hoping that by being alone Lisa would calm down and come to her senses. Maybe she really just wanted to be alone for a couple of days. The day after his wife left, Robert went to the grocery store after work. As he stopped in front of the refrigerator with the meat and began to see which piece looked fresher, his attention shifted to something bright looming to his right. He looked in that direction and spotted a familiar face. It was Katie, a longtime friend of his wife's. She had a cart full of groceries, and she looked puzzled and gloomy. The man called out to her, and she immediately recognized him and walked over embarrassed. A small conversation ensued. Katie thought Lisa was in the store now, too, but when she heard that she had gone to her parents, she visibly sank. "Gone?" Katie asked again. "That's weird. She didn't even tell me anything about it." She lowered her head thoughtfully again. Then a fleeting realization flashed across her face, and she looked at Robert without blinking. "Are you busy right now?" she asked suddenly. "Do you want to sit somewhere? It's not far." He glanced once more at the cart, which was almost filled to the top with food. "Where's Rich? Isn't he with you?" the man asked. "Rich? No, him," she answered, and then she got sad for a second. "Maybe you could help me with the bags?" she asked briskly. "Sure. You don't have to get it up all together," Robert laughed. The man drove Katie to her house, then carried all the heavy packages to her apartment. In gratitude for his help, the woman invited him to tea. Robert inwardly resisted it, but for decency's sake he agreed. He did not want to offend his hostess. Katie quickly prepared some tea and they talked a little. At one point, the man noticed that his wife's friend began to sit closer to him and even flirted a little noticeably. But in her eyes, he still saw some kind of longing. For a while, Robert ignored her flirting because he had no plans to cheat on his wife, no matter how attractive Katie was. But when she touched his knee with her hand, trembling with excitement, he couldn't stand it and said, "Katie, I have a wife, and you have a husband. Don't do anything foolish." His serious tone seemed to bring her to her senses. She suddenly covered her face with her hands and began to sob. Robert hadn't expected such a reaction, and frankly, he was confused and didn't know what to do. He clumsily put his hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. The woman jerked sharply at that touch. How was she ever going to continue her flirtations? "I'm sorry," Kate began. "I just wanted to get back at Lisa like that." She closed her arms again and continued to cry. The man lost all comprehension of what was going on. "What do you mean, Revenge? Revenge for what? He kept asking questions. You really don't know? Your wife is sleeping with my husband, and now they are going somewhere together, and you and I have been fooled. Robert looked at Katie like she was crazy. What are you talking about? With indignation, he got up abruptly from the table and pushed it aside. Why didn't she ask you to come along? How long has she been thinking about her parents and visiting them? The woman said. It was like an electric shock to the man. Katie's words had hurt him, and the suspicion that he had felt, but had studiously shunned away from himself, had gripped him again. Anger boiled up inside Robert, and he was rarely really angry. But before he did anything, he had to be sure that these accusations were not idle speculation, desperate women. Are you sure about them? He asked Katie. You still don't believe it? Okay, why don't you call her now, and I'll call mine a little later. He never puts the phone on silent. Let's see if they're there or not. With a heavy heart, Robert picked up the phone and pressed the call. He could feel the pressure pounding in his ears. The seconds of waiting felt like an eternity. Lisa picked up the phone as if nothing had happened. It was quiet in the background. Hi, are you home? Asked the husband. Hi. Well, yes, is something wrong? With suspicion in her voice, the woman said. Robert began to wonder how she was doing. What's up with the parents? He signaled, sitting next to Katie, to dial her husband. After a few moments, a ringtone came out of Robert's handset, but almost immediately the ringtone dropped. Katie whispered, Wishing you a good night's rest with Rich. Threw the man into the phone and hung up. Katie looked at the man meaningfully, and her whole look said, I told you so. Whose apartment is this? Is it yours? Shared? Suddenly asked Robert sternly. My mother-in-law's, said the woman. Well, then get ready to go to my place, he said, and looked her seriously in the eyes, just as you wanted. Let's play on jealousy. Lisa's actions were easily predicted by her husband. First, she called him in a panic to find out what the misunderstanding was, and then the very next day, she came back home. Robert stood in the doorway, not letting her in. Just let her in, Robert. Is there something on your mind? I told you where I was, said the wife with irritation. At that moment, a female figure in a short silk robe slipped behind her husband and called to the table in an affectionate voice. Lisa's face immediately stretched. She recognized her friend, but she had never expected to see her here, and moreover, in such an appearance. Inside, the possessive person Lisa had been all her life, everything was fuming. She did not like it when people took what was hers, and her friend knew it well. Lisa's mouth was filled with a profanity that would have made even a cobbler's ears wither. Robert just smirked, asked her to stay out of his apartment, and closed the door right in front of his unfaithful, angry wife. After a couple of days, the man packed up all of Lisa's belongings and sent her straight to her lover's house. With Katie, they became very close and surprisingly well matched, so they continued to live together, while simultaneously filing for a divorce from their previous lovers. Lisa went to live with Rich, but for a long time, she never stopped being angry with her husband and girlfriend. Their revenge hurt her a lot, and finally broke the fact that then they all went well. Against this background, the woman began to have fits of jealousy with Rich. She nagged him every time he stayed away from work even briefly, and this, in turn, contributed to the fact that he was more and more in no hurry to come home. Quarrel after quarrel, and there was little left of the former passion. Lisa lost that relationship as well. Now, however, she had plenty of time to find a new victim. That's the story. Share in the comments what you think about this situation and the behavior of the characters. And thank you for listening to the story to the end. Have a nice day.